entrepreneurial, leadership, intellectual. This is the Cultural Connections Podcast.
Hello, everybody. My name is Brian Ives, and I am the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections Podcast. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to remind all of our viewers, either watching or listening to this podcast, that we are recording this episode live on Thursday, May 4th, 2023, and we are live streaming here on Facebook. Therefore, if you have a question for our guest today, please comment below here on Facebook with your question. We'll do our best to answer your question live. Even if we're not live and you still come up with a question after the live or are watching from some other platform, get in touch with me and I'll do my best to get your questions answered for you. So please definitely do that. Without further ado, today on the podcast, we will be exploring creativity and climatic identity. Joining me on the podcast is Chris Fussner. Chris Fussner is the founder of Tropical Futures Institute, is a multidisciplinary designer and strategist who explores intersections of art and technology. A founding curator at Art Dubai's first digital section, Chris is releasing a range of collaborations this year with various artists and brands from around the world. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
Thank you again. Now, before we do go any further, I do want to make one little claim here on the podcast, because a lot of you either watching or listening to this podcast are probably thinking, wait a second, you already had Chris Fussner on the podcast. And you would be right if you thought that. However, we had the father of Chris Fussner's father, Chris Fussner, also on this podcast, which if you actually pay attention to our opening intro of this podcast and you're watching it, you will notice at the opening that first person in the opening is the father of Chris Fussner's father, Chris Fussner. So we get father and son on the podcast. It's again,
great combo.
Absolutely. So without further ado there, can you, before we go any further, can you provide us a little bit more in depth about your background, and we'll go from there?
Sure. So I've been working in the creative field for the last 15 plus years or so, in a variety of different capacities, from fashion production to research, creative direction, hardware research to like biz dev strategy, and more recently doing more digital strategy and things related to like crypto, as well as new media, like with Art Dubai. And then currently right now, the studio, we're working on a release with a brand from LA called Denim Tears. So it's the personal brand for the creative director of Supreme, Tremaine Emery. So knock on wood, almost done. The release should be coming out this like June. And then between that, just sort of exploring the tropics and, doing our bit in terms of helping to spread like contemporary culture, as well as connect people from all around the world to, in most cases, the Philippines, but to ASEAN at large. And then, looking forward to just continuing to connect to more, tropical cultures and people around the world in the years to come with Tropical Futures.
Oh, that's great. Can you tell us a little bit more about what led you to start this company, Tropical Futures? What and how did that all come to be?
Yeah. So initially, it was more of a side project. I have a background also in construction management and property development. So I was working on a co-living development in the Philippines. So it's, co-living is one way to address high density urban areas, especially in cities or countries without strong public housing or public support in that regard. So yeah, so co-living is a way to sort of address that. And then through a design angle, I felt like we could provide a better product for people. So while I was like focusing on the startup, in my free time, I would put together shows, events, exhibitions, and it was sort of my way to keep my sort of one foot in a creative process, even though, I was working in more of an urban and architectural sort of process and framework. It's still very much creative, but it's very focused in a specific area. So this was just a way for me to also make friends. Moving to the Philippines, even though I'm half Filipino, it was a way for me to engage and meet people. Meet people there and understand more about what's going on in the Philippines from a contemporary cultural perspective. And yeah, so it started off with just these like small side projects, like t-shirts, zines, hats, stickers, organizing Zine Fest. We had a residency program for a few years. And then eventually we started doing more commercial. I think as COVID hit, my work in the Philippines ended because, COVID kind of put a halt to a lot of things. And I transitioned out of the Philippines and just started focusing more on tropical futures as a creative, just as my main creative practice or sort of outlet / consultancy. And then today it's very multidisciplinary, which is a blessing and a curse in some ways, because, it keeps everything really fun and exciting and new projects, new spaces. But then sometimes not really optimizing. But with that said, it's, still step by step, still a process. And yeah.
Absolutely. No, that's great. That's absolutely great. Let's talk about then what are some current trends or innovations in your field that you find particularly exciting right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think on one angle, the idea of featuring has really become quite I'd say quite prolific with regards to, I think when we started TFI and when I was looking into featuring or speculative design and some of these, or existential risk, there's very few programs around the world, and there, even, that many, people looking into that sort of space. Nowadays there's, every major design university or business university has some sort of innovation or featuring program. And at the time when I started Tropical Futures, a lot of these featuring scenarios didn't really encompass the tropics, and and it was more related to white futures, or you had Afrofuturism, you had Hollywood futures. At the time when I started it, there was also this one artist and theorist in China, Lawrence Leck. Sorry, UK. He's Malaysian UK, but he wrote a video essay called Sino-Futurism, and Tropical Futures was very much a response to that, as well as these other sort of features. So I think one thing that's happening now is there's this idea of inclusive futures where any sort of person, identity, situation, geographical location is thinking about the future. So this idea of inclusive futures, which was covered by a writer last year, which also interviewed Tropical Futures on Wired magazine, it's sort of, I think, pointing towards that direction of just having more, I think, a broader range of ideas on how we can engage with future scenarios. And so I would say that's one trend, and it's more of like it's more from an identity perspective, but also from the proliferation of the idea of this sort of practice. in some ways, there's almost too much featuring. Like the future is kind of boring, as a friend of mine says, Shuman Nassar. He says it's way more fun to predict the present because you don't really know what's going to happen, right? When you look at these sort of long-term models, you can kind of have an idea on how things diffuse and sort of unfold. I mean, besides that, I'm sure some other hosts have already talked about, but like AI, in the creative field, but also in the idea of futuring or investing or any sort of mental model or framework. I think, ChatGPT really, turning things on its head. And, as I come out of this sort of sabbatical / time away from work, the first thing I did, when I got back is I just subscribed to GPT-4, and I've just been trying to use it in my workflow. And it definitely feels like a moment where it's like being able to use email or like Microsoft Office when you're applying for a job. And it feels like a really critical skill set. So that's all the rage right now. And I think that's sort of really shifted how we might think about startups or how we go about in processes and workflows. And I mean, it's more of a general trend, but it does affect so many spaces and, design, creativity, to, digital, to startups, to tech, and so on. Anything that touches a computer, I think has this sort of impact of disruption. So I think my next project I'm trying to do is just we're looking for a new apartment to move into. I'm calling on Milan. So I'm going to try to look up some sort of strategies I can do with ChatGPT to sort of perhaps optimize what might be a good area to rent or look at.
Very interesting, very interesting. And before we go any further, I just want to remind our viewers that are watching us live here at either on the live Facebook feed or just watching or listening to the podcast in general, that this is the Cultural Connections Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Ives, and we are talking today about exploring creativity and climatic identity. And we're joined by Chris Fussner, the founder of Tropical Futures Institute. So let's jump into our next question here to you. And you specifically, which actually brings into an interesting point. You talked about AI for a second ago as a challenge in a way, and I wanted to talk about problem solving in your work. Let's talk specifically about, because I've been hearing so much about AI recently, and it is a growing thing for the future. How does that impact your work? AI impact your work specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think for what I do on a number of levels, when it comes to, creativity, it's like using it in the workflow in the process. So, maybe optimizing briefs, even perhaps using it for initial concept sketches, if you're using something like Midjourney. But I think also just like optimizing basic workflow, like using it in social media, for example, to generate captions. And, and I think I'm only scratching the surface in terms of process. Like I haven't really chained it up, like using Zapier and things like that, where you can do these sort of automated workflows or processes. So I think it's just like, it basically gives a huge boost in productivity and what you're able to do. So because of this sort of this new tool, I think it also makes us try to reframe and look at certain businesses that will be touched by this space. And I think from a creative perspective, it's also been really interesting. Like there's this one Indian artist, Pratika Kora, and like they've been using Midjourney to develop these sort of like futuristic scenarios in India, basically. So it's like, you don't have to wait for Hollywood or CGI or a specialist in some sort of, you can really just use natural language to prompt these sort of scenarios. And you're also seeing it too in fashion. I'm pretty sure this last season, I'm sure there was a few brands that have already done AI inspired or influenced collections. And you're just sort of seeing this sort of huge, it's just so hot, right? So everyone's just like rushing to it and trying to figure out how to optimize it. And to the point where you're seeing we see different like prompt websites where you can buy prompts or prompt archives where you can sort of see a collection of prompts from working out to people engineering prompts where you can like input like your weight, height, blah 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 blah, and then it'll spit out like a custom prompt for you that you can prompt Chat GPT with. You're just seeing like all these sort of different interesting things, and obviously just like a gold rush in Silicon Valley with just tons of VCs raising for the space. And it remains to be seen like if building out people building out customized suites or solutions versus like something more general like ChatGPT. But yeah, definitely changing the paradigm right now.
Absolutely, definitely. I mean, from everything that I've heard too, yes, definitely. Then let's specifically go in a more general approach now. And how do you approach problem solving in general in your work?
Yeah, so I try to just take a multi-stakeholder approach, and I guess that's more from like some of my design research background, where trying to sort of aggregate different opinions or ideas about a certain project, whether it's like collaborators or my colleagues. And I think, taking that approach, and it's more of a collaborative process. It's definitely challenging because like a lot of times it's just easy to go like, my vision and just go with it. But I think in creating these compromises, you sort of are able to produce certain projects, solutions, ideas that you wouldn't have usually produced on your own. So yeah, to answer your question, just sort of try to do it as collaborative as possible. But obviously, sometimes like a decentralized or a collaborative process can slow things down. So it really depends on the situation. But in most cases, with time, yeah.
Absolutely, definitely. Before again, I want to just one more time remind our viewers here that are just tuning in, either watching or listening to the podcast, that this is the Cultural Connections podcast. We're recording live to Facebook on Thursday, May 4th, 2023, and we're exploring creativity and climatic identity. And we're joined by Chris Fussner, the founder of Tropical Futures Institute. So if you have questions that you'd like answered, please feel free to comment below on here on Facebook, and we'll do our best to answer while we are live. Now, my next question then to you is, how do you balance form and function in your designs?
It's a great question. I think nowadays it's more, less about functionality and more about just fantastical. So I think that's sort of, just like flipping the idea of function into a more twisted context. Because I mean, like in terms of design, as of late, I think doing more creative direction with designers and creatives, and it just depends on the situation. But like for some upcoming designs, it's more critical and sort of questioning certain things, like a tourist t-shirt, and just sort of questioning that and the design, and then kind of twisting and flipping that as a design object that also brings about like certain, I think, political and economic sort of strings to like developing a raw, untouched space, and yeah.
Interesting,
So
very
yeah.
interesting. Absolutely. Can you walk us through your creative process then and tell us a little bit about your creative process?
Yeah. Creatively, I would say it's sort of similar to that initial problem solving question where we, it's just more of a wide net is cast. And then, we just sort of tap into sort of, maybe a certain strain of thought, or perhaps there is a trend or something we want to reply to, um, and sort of just drill down from that in terms of either writing, imagery, text, or some sort of supporting images to sort of start a process of world building, or depending on the project, right? Like if it's graphics, it's a little bit simpler. If it's a bigger, larger project that requires like a sense of world building outside of the current world of tropical futures, then we'll just sort of start constructing for that. And yeah, most times it is a shared mood board, or a shared brief or vision. And then in some cases, depending on the project, there might be some diagramming or or just like sketching.
I
I mean,
see.
and I think in this case, we probably throw in Chat GPT in terms of certain prompts or image generation.
Interesting, definitely very interesting. Um, let's jump in then to the fact that how do you keep yourself inspired and motivated with your work?
Yeah, I think it's just sort of, I would say a big part of that is just working with younger people. Um, I'm not that old, but like I'm like 35, so working with people that are in their 20s, keeps everything fresh and on edge in terms of like, okay, like this is happening, that's happening. And I think that sort of intergenerational sharing of knowledge and references sort of keeps things very exciting. And then you're sort of kept on the pulse of things.
Very interesting. That makes a lot of sense, I would say. But we sort of touched the bare minimum on this earlier, a little bit earlier on in the podcast, and that was with technology. Specifically, we talked about AI. But let's see more in a more broad scope now. How do you see technology impacting the future of your field?
I mean, like it's not a huge impact. I mean, outside of AI, right? Obviously, AI is like shaking up everything. I would just say, like, if anything, just the big thing is just sort of diffusion of internet, and the sort of continued, I think, adoption to some alternative practices in design. And I think within the context of design, there's just like a shifting landscape of different types of design outside of the traditional like graphic, UI, UX, architecture, and so on. So I think within that, it's just more the shifting of knowledge formations around different design practices, and that being used in business or work or in consultancies or agencies and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, we really talked about AI quite a bit, but outside of that, I would say it's just sort of like these general trends of just a diffusion of these different types of designs.
Interesting, very interesting. I'm just going to again one more time remind our viewers at home, either whether you're watching or listening here to this is the Cultural Connections podcast. I'm your host, Brian Ives, and this is the Cultural Connections podcast. We are live on Thursday, May 4th, 2023, live streaming to Facebook, and we're exploring creativity and climatic identity with our guest, Chris Fussner, the founder of Tropical Futures Institute. My next question then to you, is specifically on Can you tell us about a project that you have worked on that you are particularly proud of and why you are proud of that project?
I mean, I guess I can speak about my most recent project with Art Dubai Digital. With Art Dubai, I mean, it was basically found in the digital section in 2020 two, and uh yeah, it was, I would say, like a big deal because it's the biggest sort of digital section in any sort of fair. It might be even the biggest, I mean, outside of like digital festivals, it's probably one of the biggest events that showcases different digital artists around the world. um and really shout out to the Art Dubai team for trusting my vision and suggestions, and to them to also just to run with it and also execute. And I think, I think in the moment it was done, like the hype cycle around NFTs and crypto helped accelerate this idea of like a digital collector, a collector of new media, of computer art, of code, of video, of games, and so on. I think it's a collector that was maybe not going to happen as soon as it did. Like perhaps, you know, if if it wasn't for that NFT cycle, I think it would have probably been a few more years at least till we would have seen more digital collectibles outside of the sphere of gaming. So yeah, it's been good because it's been nice to see that impact in the local scene of Dubai and that region, but also the international sort of ripples it's sort of made through supporting galleries, artist collectives, and practitioners around the world through this sort of digital section in Art Dubai.
I see. Very interesting. Very interesting. Absolutely. Um, let's talk about then, how do you think cultural influences shape some design slash technology slash art?
Yeah, so I think it's important. Uh, I would say, like, not trying to step into the idea of identity politics completely, but just more into like bringing in different geographical voices into some of these sort of technology streams or design movements, artistic movements. Um, and I think it's just it's important to have diverse voices. Like a lot of the world's challenges, whether it's coming from like global warming or overpopulation in urban areas to infrastructural issues, a lot of it's coming from the tropics, and a lot of the brunt of current global warming trends is being felt by the tropics right now. So, I think having voices from all around the world, and we're starting to see that more and more now as as we sort of shift into this sort of multi polar society. There's less of this sort of Westo-centric, unipolar US hegemonic sort of worldview, and we're seeing more diversity in mainstream pop cultural references, from things like K-pop to Bali and Nollywood, and just like seeing a wider range of voices. And I think that's important in sort of constructing different products, scenarios, technology, and whatnot, right? Because like, especially when you're building public goods or building products that are going to touch a lot of large groups of people, I think having those sort of voices there is definitely important.
Absolutely, definitely, I agree with you. Again, just one more time here, want to remind our viewers at home that are either watching or listening to this that this is the Cultural Connections podcast. We are live on Facebook on Thursday, May 4th, 2023, and we are exploring creativity and climatic identity with Chris Fussner, founder of Tropical Futures Institute. Therefore, if you have a question for Chris today and would like to get your question answered while we are live, please feel free to comment below here on Facebook, and we will do our best to getting your questions answered. Even if we are not live, still write your questions to us and we'll get them answered for you. My next question unto you is, how do you incorporate user feedback into your designs or projects?
I guess like, we're I guess this is like where it's a little bit more of artistic practice because like we're not really building I would say like forward facing in the sense like usable, like we're not building applications and stuff like that. But um like depending on the stakeholders in the project, that's obviously taken into consideration. But sometimes like we will factor in like ideas or suggestions from the community, but it's something that we've been thinking about in terms of like creating like a Telegram chat or something more of a discussion chat room versus having just just posting on social media and stuff like that. And some friends have done this where they have like a Discord or some sort of like digital space where people can hang out and talk to each other.
I see. Very, very interesting. That makes sense. Okay, as we start to reach now, already hard to believe, near the end of this podcast, can you tell us how do you, within the last few minutes that we have, how do you stay up to date with the latest development and changes in your field?
I think it goes back to the earlier question, just about intergenerational learning is important, and that's how I stay up to date on one end, and then other end. I guess like when you're working in culture and design and anything creative, I think like having, just pattern recognition really in terms of being able to recognize certain like cultural movements or certain like anomalies or redundancies that may happen. And like it can point towards like some sort of cultural shift or movement. But outside of just that, I would just say it's really the thing I've been trying to focus more on, just learning from different people of different age groups, older and younger.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. I can understand exactly what you're saying. I think it makes sense. Well, it's hard to believe this has been another very fascinating episode here of the Cultural Connections podcast. I want to thank Chris Fussner for joining me today. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes of the podcast, please feel free to get in touch with me. You can reach me via email at brianives@gmail.com. That's BRIANIV as in Victor, ES@gmail.com. And once again, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please feel free to get in contact with me. Thank you again here to Chris Fussner for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. And this is the Cultural Connections podcast. I'm Brian Ives, and I'm the producer and host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Thanks for watching.
Thank you again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast. For more information on today's episode, be sure to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also watch this episode again in its entirety on our YouTube channel. This podcast is also available on listening platforms Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Breaker, Radio Public, and New TV. Thanks again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast.